Chapter 1. Tea and trouble at Fernwood House. The May afternoon at Fernwood House had the kind of languid warmth that made even the bees drowsy. The annual Fernwood Garden Tea, a highlight of the St. Mildred's on the Green social calendar, was in full swing, and the broad lawns shimmered under a pale sun. Tables laden with sponge cakes, cucumber sandwiches, and gleaming pots of tea dotted the garden, while village ladies in pastel dresses fluttered about like butterflies. Miss Marple, resplendent in a sensible straw hat with a lilac ribbon, sat at a shaded table near the rose arbour, a plate of seed cake untouched before her. She smiled politely at the flow of gossip around her, her sharp blue eyes missing nothing. Fernwood House belonged to Miss Lavinia Vine, a former society beauty who had returned to the village after the mysterious death of her husband abroad, a matter of some speculation even now, 15 years later. Lavinia was hosting the tea in aid of the St. Mildred's Hospital Fund, but her smiles were tight, and her gloved hands clutched the handle of her teacup a fraction too tightly. The event, thus far, had been a success. No rain, no scandal, and only 2 minor disagreements over the placement of the jam tarts. That was until, quite suddenly, the mood shifted. It began with a faint commotion near the south terrace, a rising murmur, a sharp gasp from Mrs. Edgecombe, who was known to faint with enthusiasm at any disturbance, and the hurried, alarmed movements of a few guests. Miss Marple rose at once, leaning lightly on her stick, and moved toward the gathering knot of people. At the heart of it, a maid from Fernwood, barely more than a child, stood pale and trembling. In her hands she clutched a piece of white crochet, no larger than a dinner plate, stained shockingly with a bright, unmistakable patch of red. Blood Lavinia Vine arrived an instant later, her complexion blanching as she took in the scene. Where did you find that?" she demanded, voice shrill. "In the old summer house, miss," the maid stammered. "On the bench. I only went to fetch the garden cushions." The summer house, a pretty octagonal structure half hidden by wisteria, had been closed off all morning, or so everyone believed. Now an ominous silence seemed to stretch between the assembled guests. Miss Marple stepped closer, peering at the crochet piece with narrowed eyes. It was a delicate work, a doily perhaps, or the beginning of a lace tablecloth, made with fine, careful stitches. And the stain, deep crimson, still tacky, told of something far more violent than an accidental prick of a needle. Within minutes, Inspector Craddock had been summoned from the village proper, and the garden tea, so promising and so proper, dissolved into disorganized clusters of anxious guests whispering behind gloved hands. Mrs. Sims, of the bakery, speculated wildly about a crime of passion. Mr. Greaves, the grocer, muttered about foreigners and suspicious sorts. Only Miss Marple, quiet and thoughtful, kept her counsel. She stood for a long moment gazing at the summer house, its door now ajar, the shadows within darkened, inviting crochet, blood, panic, and above all, a terrible certainty rising in her mind. This was no accident. Something had happened at Fernwood House. Something ugly, something hidden beneath layers of polite smiles and lace gloves. And somewhere among the seemingly innocent villagers sipping tea and nibbling Victoria sponge, someone had left a clue. A Clue in Crochet. Chapter 2. Whispered Theories and Watchful Eyes. The discovery of the blood-stained crochet sent a ripple through St. Mildred's on the Green that no amount of tea or good manners could suppress. By nightfall, the entire village knew that something dreadful had occurred at Fernwood House, though precisely what, no one could yet say with certainty. Miss Marple, having returned to her cottage at Danemid, sat quietly in her drawing-room that evening, knitting a neat row of primrose yellow wool. Outside, the lamplight cast soft halos on the misty lane, and from a nearby house the faint strains of a piano could be heard. Someone practising scales, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents now coursing through their peaceful village. News, Miss Marple reflected, moved faster in a village than the sharpest wind. It didn't matter that the inspector had asked for discretion. Discretion was never a strong point among people who had known one another's foibles for generations. By breakfast the next morning, the gossip had bloomed into a full parade of wild stories. At the bakery, Mrs. Sims recounted, with considerable embellishment, that the summer house had been positively dripping with blood, and that the entire south garden was cordoned off with police tape. In reality, a single rope and a polite constable. At the post office, Mr. Greaves was telling anyone who would listen that the blood had been found alongside a discarded glove. A man's glove, mark my words, meaning it was a duel, a crime of passion. Meanwhile, Mrs. Weatherby, from her perch at the window of Ivy Cottage, declared that she had seen a suspicious figure loitering near Fernwood's back gate a few nights prior. Although under questioning, it emerged that the figure might also have been the vicar's dog chasing a hedgehog. Miss Marple, moving quietly through the village with her market basket, observed all this with a gentle, inward amusement. It was always the same. When faced with real fear, people spun fantasies, more extravagant than any truth. The human mind, when unsettled, craved patterns, even false ones, to explain the disruption. In the centre of it all, Lavinia Vine remained silent. Fernwood House, once the scene of such lively teas and garden parties, had drawn its curtains and shut its gates. Lavinia had issued a terse statement to the Reverend, who passed it on dutifully at Sunday service, thanking the villagers for their concern and asking for privacy. Privacy, however, was the one thing the villagers were unlikely to grant. Speculation turned inevitably toward Lavinia herself. "She's hiding something, you can be sure," Mrs. Edgecombe whispered behind her hymn book. After all, there was that business with her husband abroad. Never explained properly, was it? "And what about her companion, Miss Hartnell?" added Mrs. Sims. "Always lurking about, pale as a ghost and twice as jumpy. Never liked the look of her." Miss Hartnell was Lavinia's live-in companion, a thin, fluttery woman who kept mostly to herself. She had lived at Fernwood for nearly 3 years, and though she was unfailingly polite, she had never quite become one of the village's own. As for the blood-stained crochet, theories abounded. Some said it was a memento from a crime committed long ago, hidden away until now. Others insisted it was a warning, left deliberately to terrify Miss Vine. The most imaginative suggested it was a coded message, part of a grander, darker scheme. Only Miss Marple, sitting quietly over her evening tea, considered the possibility that the clue was neither dramatic nor distant, but immediate. Crochet, after all, was a domestic thing, a small, careful art. One rarely associated it with violence, unless one understood, as Miss Marple did, that violence often crept into the gentlest of places. Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock worked methodically, taking statements from the guests, who had attended the tea. Each had seen nothing, of course, or had seen so much that the information became useless in its contradictions. Some claimed they had noticed a figure slipping away toward the wisteria. Others insisted the summer-house door was firmly shut throughout the afternoon. Miss Marple allowed herself to be questioned like the others. She spoke mildly, recalling nothing unusual, except for one detail, so small she might have forgotten. It had she not learned, through long experience, that tiny details were often the most telling. Miss Hartnell, she said thoughtfully to the inspector, seemed quite anxious that afternoon. Far more anxious than I would have expected, given the circumstances. Craddock looked up sharply. How so? She was carrying a basket of crochet work, Miss Marple said. She does beautiful lace, you know. But she was very flustered, dropped it at one point, scattered threads and pins all over the terrace, most unlike her usual composure. The inspector made a note of it, and she disappeared for some time just before the maid found the crochet. I believe so, said Miss Marple, but then many people were wandering about. It was a most informal gathering. Craddock grunted. He respected Miss Marple's instincts, even when they were presented with the softness of a knitting needle. As the investigation stretched into its second day, tensions sharpened. At the White Hart Inn, murmurs turned to mutterings. Old suspicions about Lavinia's wealth resurfaced. Quiet accusations against newcomers like Miss Hartnell gained ground. The village, outwardly tidy and proper, began to reveal its fissures, and Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to recognize the fault lines of human nature, knew that somewhere, among the whispered half-truths, the real story waited. Not the story the villagers spun to comfort themselves, but the darker, messier truth of ambition, fear, and perhaps, just perhaps, murder. Miss Marple set down her teacup that night and looked thoughtfully toward the small piece of crochet she had borrowed from her own work-basket for inspection. There was a pattern in crochet, she mused, just as there was a pattern in people. It only needed patient, careful eyes to trace it back to its tangled beginning. And Miss Marple had patience enough for 100 villages like St. Mildred's. Chapter 3. Threads Begin to Show. The morning after the Fernwood tea incident, Inspector Craddock arrived at the village green, notebook in hand, his heavy boots crunching over the damp spring grass. He was not a ship, man easily rattled, but this case, blood-stained crochet, hidden secrets, and whispers of old scandals, had already proven itself more tangled than most. Miss Marple, invited by the Reverend Forsyth for a discreet breakfast meeting under the guise of parish matters, found herself conveniently seated nearby when Craddock stopped in for a quick word with the vicar. Over scones and strong tea, the conversation turned, quite naturally, to the subject on every villager's lips. "I've been thinking," Miss Marple said gently, adjusting the little lace cuffs at her wrists, "that it's rather curious, Inspector, how such an ordinary object, a piece of crochet, became the centre of such a disturbance." Craddock, who had learned the value of Miss Marple's musings, set down his cup with a grunt of interest. "Oh, yes. Yes, said Miss Marple, tilting her head slightly. You see, crochet is a private craft. One does not crochet for public display in the way one might paint or carve. It is something made by hand, over long hours, usually with particular feeling attached to it. Craddock frowned, reaching slowly for his notebook. You think the crochet piece was deliberately chosen, not random? I do, said Miss Marple, serenely. And whoever left it there, whether they meant to or not, left a part of themselves stitched into that choice. Craddock scribbled a few words, but Miss Marple could see he was not yet fully convinced. That was all right. Some patterns took longer to reveal themselves. Later that morning, Inspector Craddock called at Fernwood House to conduct a more formal set of interviews. Miss Marple, through no intention of her own, étouffe, or so she would assure anyone who asked, happened to stroll by on the lane at just the right moment to be drawn inside by Mrs. Vine herself. Lavinia Vine greeted them stiffly in the grand but fading drawing-room. The years had softened Fernwood's edges. The rugs were worn thin in places, the furniture polished but dated. Lavinia herself was composed but brittle, her hands worrying at the pearl clasp of her cardigan. "My dear Lavinia," Miss Marple said warmly, allowing herself to be seated near the window. "Such trying times, and so terribly unfair to you." Lavinia smiled, a small, strained thing. "Thank you, Jane. It is a dreadful business. Dreadful. I cannot think who would wish to harm anyone in my household." Craddock's questions were gentle, but persistent. He asked about the guests, the timing, the movements around the garden. Lavinia answered carefully, but it was clear she had little to offer. When it came to Miss Hartnell, however, a slight hesitation flickered in her manner. "She is devoted," Lavinia said carefully, "but highly strung. Poor nerves, you understand. She is not as resilient as she once was." Miss Marple's eyes brightened behind her spectacles. Poor nerves, highly strung. Such phrases could conceal a multitude of tensions. Miss Hartnell herself was summoned to the drawing-room. She entered with a jerky, apologetic curtsy, her hands twisting at the hem of her sleeve. Pale and bird-like, she looked as though a sharp word would shatter her. Inspector Craddock questioned her about her movements during the tea. Miss Hartnell wrung her hands. I was arranging the charity donations inside for a time, sir. Mrs. Vine asked me to. There were envelopes to be sorted, small sums collected for the hospital fund. And after that, I stepped outside for air, just briefly. The sun was warm. I took my basket of crochet with me. But then I realized I had left my scissors behind, and I went back inside. Miss Marple observed all this without comment, her knitting needles clicking steadily in her lap. A basket of crochet, an absent pair of scissors, a solitary stroll. It all sounded plausible. And yet there was a tremor beneath Miss Hartnell's words, a quiver of panic not easily explained by the mere finding of bloodied lace. Inspector Craddock, ever practical, asked to see the crochet basket. Miss Hartnell fetched it obediently. A simple willow affair, lined in faded muslin. Inside were several skeins of white thread, a small pincushion, a half-finished table runner, and a pair of fine, delicate scissors with mother-of-pearl handles. Miss Marple's fingers hovered a moment longer than necessary over the scissors. Beautiful things. Sharp, elegant, dangerous, in the wrong hands. Nothing appeared out of place. But Miss Marple's mind was ticking quietly behind her mild smile. By the time they left Fernwood House, the sun was higher in the sky, casting harsh light over the sleepy village lanes. Children played in the puddles from last night's rain. A cat stretched luxuriously on a windowsill. Life, outwardly, continued untouched, and yet Miss Marple, walking slowly toward her own neat garden gate, felt the unseen threads tightening. There was fear in Fernwood House, and fear, she knew, left traces as surely as blood. That evening, sitting by her own hearth, with a tray of simple supper, bread, butter, and a slice of seed cake, Miss Marple took out her own crochet work. She set it carefully on her lap and examined the pattern. Loops and chains, knots and stitches, all building towards something whole. People were the same. Small actions, small omissions, building slowly toward a complete picture, if only one had the patience to watch it form. The blood-stained crochet was no mere symbol. It was a message, a cry from within the polished surface of Fernwood, from someone trapped too long by secrets, pride, and silent desperation. Miss Marple smiled softly to herself as she threaded a needle. The threads were beginning to show, and she would follow them, quietly and carefully, to whatever dark heart they led her. Chapter 4. The Convenient Villain by midweek. The village of St. Mildred's on the Green had, in its usual methodical fashion, found its first suspect. It was inevitable, really. In every village, when something dreadful happens, suspicion finds the most convenient home. And this time it landed squarely at the door of Mr. Harold Sims, son of Mrs. Sims the baker, and a young man who had accumulated a quiet but persistent reputation for bad temper and poor company. Miss Marple first heard the murmurs while browsing the shelves of the village library. Two ladies from the Mothers' Union, unaware of her sharp hearing, were whispering fiercely by the periodicals. Always had a temper, that boy. Threw a hammer at his uncle once. And drinking, down at the White Hart of an evening, red-faced and surly. But crochet, though, doesn't seem his sort of thing, does it? Still, men like that, they lash out, never need much of a reason. Miss Marple smiled politely as she passed them, but tucked the conversation neatly away. It was not long before Inspector Craddock, pressed by mounting village pressure and a few awkward questions from the local magistrate, decided to pay Harold Sims a visit. Harold lived in rooms above the bakery, a gloomy little flat that always smelled faintly of yeast and scorched pastry. He opened the door at Craddock's knock, blinking blearily in the morning light. "Mr. Sims," Craddock said with his usual bluntness, "we'd like a word." Harold, sullen and suspicious by nature, immediately bristled. "What for? I've done nothing. Just routine inquiries," Craddock said smoothly. "You attended the Fernwood Garden tea?" "Didn't want to," Harold muttered. "Mum made me. Said it'd be disrespectful not to show." "And your movements during the event?" "Had a slice of cake, stood about listening to those old hens gossip, and slipped off early. Didn't go near the summer house." Craddock's brows lifted. "You left early?" "About 3:30. Ask anyone. I couldn't stand it." As Harold spoke, Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in a corner of the bakery below, noticed several important things. First, Harold's resentment was real, thick and choking. But second, and more crucially, he was defensive about everything, not just the events of Candlemas Eve. His guilt was broad, general, the guilt of a man who believed the world against him, but not necessarily the guilt of a murderer. Craddock, thorough but not unkind, pressed Harold further. Did he know anything about the crochet? Had he ever been near the summer house? Harold only scowled deeper. Crochet? I don't know the first thing about it. I'd sooner wear a skirt than sit, fiddling with lace. Miss Marple's lips twitched faintly at that remark. He sounded genuinely baffled. By the time Craddock left, Harold Sims was red-faced with indignation, but still very much at liberty. "That won't hold," Craddock muttered grimly, as they walked back toward the green. "Sims is a nasty piece of work, but I don't think he's our man, or woman for that matter." Miss Marple nodded serenely. "No, indeed. Besides, Inspector, crochet is a skill not picked up overnight. Whoever left that piece was intimately familiar with fine work. The tension of the stitches, the subtle patterning." She paused, smiling up at him. "I dare say Harold Sims couldn't crochet a chain stitch if his life depended on it." Craddock chuckled despite himself. The real question now was, who could? That afternoon Miss Marple took it upon herself to pay a few visits of her own. Visits disguised as social calls, of course. Inquiries made with all the soft persistence of a gentle rain eroding stone. She called first at the vicarage, ostensibly to deliver a jar of her famous quince jelly to Mrs. Forsyth. Over tea, she casually asked after the various ladies of the parish, particularly those known for their needlework. "Oh, we've several excellent craftswomen," Mrs. Forsyth said proudly. "Miss Hartnell, of course. Mrs. Weatherby used to make beautiful lace before her eyesight failed. And Mrs. Vine, well, she was quite a talent once, though she doesn't take up the needle much these days." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Miss Hartnell again. Always fluttering at the edges of the affair, always pale and nervous, like a bird sensing the presence of a hawk." Before leaving, Miss Marple allowed herself one more seemingly harmless observation. "I often think," she said, "that the act of crochet tells one a great deal about a person, the patience required, the care, and, of course, the temperament." Mrs. Forsyth agreed warmly, little realizing the significance. Later, as Miss Marple walked homeward past the high hedges and budding lilacs, she reflected on the nature of guilt and fear. It was easy, so easy, for a village to point a finger at the loud, the surly, the obvious misfits. But true darkness often wore quieter clothes, and those who feared discovery most were rarely those who shouted their innocence. They were the ones who shrank from notice, who trembled at the mention of hidden things, whose fingers, perhaps, stitched tiny trembling patterns late into the night. By the time the sun sank low behind the hills, Miss Marple had made up her mind. The village had found its convenient villain, but Miss Marple, sharp-eyed and soft-spoken, was already following a different thread entirely, one far more delicate and far more dangerous. The true culprit, she knew, was not who the village thought, and soon the next stitch in the pattern would reveal itself. Chapter 5. A Stitch Out of Place. The following morning dawned bright and brisk, the sort of day that in normal times would have seen St. Mildred's on the Green bustling with quiet satisfaction, tidying gardens, posting letters, and exchanging gossip at the market. But today, an odd sense of restraint hung over the village. Conversations that would have normally been shouted across the green were now conducted in careful murmurs. Even the bells from St. Mildred's church seemed to ring a little more cautiously. Miss Marple, however, was undeterred. After a hearty breakfast of porridge and a boiled egg, she set out with purpose, her sensible shoes clicking neatly along the cobbles. She had a particular visit in mind, one that might, if handled gently, yield something the inspector's more official inquiries could not. Her destination was Miss Hartnell's small sitting-room at Fernwood House. Miss Hartnell received her, nervously smoothing her skirts and offering a tray of weak tea and stale biscuits with trembling hands. "Oh, Miss Marple, such dreadful times!" she fluttered, dabbing at her forehead with a lace-edged handkerchief. "Such terrible, terrible misfortune for dear Lavinia! And the village, so cruel, so quick to whisper!" Miss Marple patted her hand kindly. "My dear, in troubled times the best thing one can do is busy oneself. Small domestic tasks are a great comfort. Don't you agree?" Miss Hartnell managed a watery smile. "Oh, yes, crochet has always been my refuge." It was exactly the opening Miss Marple had been hoping for. "How lovely," she said warmly. "May I see what you're working on?" Blushing, Miss Hartnell fetched a small wicker basket from a nearby side table. Inside lay a half-finished table runner, fine, intricate work in a delicate snowflake pattern. Miss Marple leaned in, admiring it with genuine appreciation. "You have such a delicate hand," she said. "Such even stitches, quite professional." Miss Hartnell flushed with pleasure. "Thank you. I was hoping to complete it for the church bazaar." Miss Marple allowed her fingers to trail lightly over the folded crochet, and there, among the white threads, she found it, something out of place. A single thread, slightly coarser, slightly darker than the rest, hardly noticeable to an untrained eye. But to Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime noting the small peculiarities of domestic life, it stood out like a cracked pearl among perfect ones. She made no outward sign of noticing. Instead, she chatted a while longer, admired Miss Hartnell's modest collection of crochet patterns, and accepted a second, equally stale biscuit with polite gratitude. By the time she left Fernwood House, her mind was ticking steadily. That coarse thread, it was not part of the runner. It was older, rougher, the kind one might find in utility work, not fine lace-making. A careless error? Perhaps, or perhaps a silent reminder that Miss Hartnell's hands had been somewhere they should not, assembling something else entirely. Miss Marple returned to Danemede Cottage to gather her thoughts. She set a tray of tea by the window and pulled out her own crochet work, placing it beside a sample of older utility lace she had in her sewing basket, the kind once used in household linens, tough and practical. Side by side, the difference was undeniable. Fine thread gleamed soft and smooth under the light. Utility thread, by contrast, was duller, thicker. Exactly the sort of thread that might have been used in the blood-stained piece found at the summer house. Exactly the sort that Miss Hartnell, in a moment of panic or haste, might have mistaken for the wrong project, or carried over without realizing it would betray her. But there was something else troubling Miss Marple, something she had not yet fully articulated even to herself. Why crochet at all? Why leave such a thing behind, when any number of objects might have served as a warning, or a distraction, or a symbol of guilt? The answer, she knew, lay not just in the object itself, but in what it represented. Crochet was not simply thread and needle. It was an act of care, of patience, and of control. Stitch by stitch, order imposed upon chaos. A thing made perfect by diligence and devotion. To leave a piece of crochet behind was not simply an accident. It was, perhaps, a desperate attempt to reassert control over a situation that had spiraled beyond it. A frantic, half-conscious imprint of the person's true nature, neat, anxious, desperate to bind together the fraying edges of a broken secret. Miss Marple sat quietly, the ticking of the clock loud in the stillness, and sipped her tea. No, Harold Sims had never been her real suspect. His guilt was too loud, too broad. The true guilty party was quieter, more careful, but ultimately more reckless, because fear, once it took root, twisted the finest instincts into betrayal. She glanced again at the coarse thread lying against the smooth white linen of her own crochet project, a stitch out of place, a life unravelling. And soon, if she was right, another clue would come to light. Another tiny, overlooked mistake that would bring the whole delicate facade crumbling down. The pattern was beginning to show itself more clearly now, and Miss Marple, with her steady hands and patient eyes, would follow it to the bitter end. Outside, the sun slipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the green. Somewhere a dog barked once, sharply, then fell silent. And in the village of St. Mildred's-on-the-Green, the quiet battle between appearances and truth crept one stitch closer to its final, inevitable unravelling. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The storm, when it broke over St. Mildred's-on-the-Green, was not one of rain or wind, but of sharpened glances, tight-lipped conversations, and whispered accusations carried on the stiff breeze of village gossip. The blood-stained Crochet, once only a whispered horror, now lay like a heavy stone at the centre of every interaction. Friendships strained under the pressure. Old grievances bubbled to the surface. At the White Hart Inn, Mrs. Weatherby was overheard telling the blacksmith's wife that Lavinia Vine had enemies. Oh yes, very old enemies. And that money, troubles, hidden affairs, and ancient scandals were sure to emerge before all was said and done. Meanwhile, Miss Hartnell, whose fluttering nerves had made her an object of pity a week earlier, now found herself the subject of sharper, more suspicious whispers. It did not escape notice that she avoided the village green, that she hurried past the shops with her head lowered, that her hands trembled more than usual when she spoke. Miss Marple, ever watchful behind her spectacles, noted it all. Fear, she reflected, was a more revealing garment than guilt. Fear revealed the patterns guilt tried to disguise, and the pattern, stitch by careful stitch, was becoming clearer. It was during a seemingly innocuous afternoon meeting of the Ladies' Guild that the first true confrontation took shape. The Guild, had convened at the village hall under the pretense of planning the upcoming spring festival. But the atmosphere was tense, brittle as spun glass. Tea was poured, biscuits were passed, but the conversation stuttered and faltered like a candle in a draught. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting, listened as Mrs. Price, the grocer's wife, asked Lavinia Vine, in a tone far too bright to be innocent, whether Fernwood House would still be hosting the festival's charity auction. Lavinia stiffened slightly. "I should think not," she said coldly. "After recent events it would hardly be seemly." A pause, sharp and bristling. Then Mrs. Sims, cheeks pink with effort, said, "But surely, Mrs. Vine, the village mustn't suffer because of private misfortunes." Miss Hartnell made a small, choked sound. The room turned subtly, almost imperceptibly, toward her. Lavinia's lips tightened into a narrow line. "Fernwood's affairs," she said, "are no business of the village." It might have ended there, but human nature, as Miss Marple knew very well, rarely allowed wounds to close so cleanly. Miss Hartnell, trembling visibly now, set down her teacup with a sharp clatter. "I have nothing to hide," she blurted suddenly, voice too loud in the hushed room. "I have served Mrs. Vine faithfully. Faithfully. If anyone suggests otherwise—" She broke off, breathing hard, the silence around her thickening. Miss Marple clicked her knitting, needles together with a soft, deliberate sound, breaking the tension just enough. "My dear Miss Hartnell," she said kindly, "no one is accusing you of anything. We are all simply concerned." But the damage had been done. The villagers, who moments before had hidden there, suspicion under smiles, now stared openly. And in that raw, painful moment, Miss Marple saw the truth writ plain on Miss Hartnell's stricken face, a truth that had less to do with guilt and more to do with unbearable, crushing fear. Later, as the meeting broke apart into uneasy farewells and rustling coats, Miss Marple found herself alone with Lavinia Vine by the parish hall's battered piano. The older woman's composure, so carefully maintained, was beginning to fray. "She's going to ruin me," Lavinia said suddenly, her voice low and bitter. "After everything I've done for her." Miss Marple adjusted her hat with slow, careful movements. "It's difficult sometimes when trust frays on both sides." "She's not what she seems," Lavinia muttered. "Not at all." Miss Marple said nothing. She merely waited, knitting, needles stilled on her lap, and Lavinia, perhaps desperate to unburden herself, continued in a harsh whisper, "She knows too much about my late husband, about the trust money, about things that should have been left buried." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, as if absorbing a piece of mildly interesting gossip, not the confession it truly was. It was always the same, she reflected later at home, setting aside her knitting to pour herself a small sherry. Secrets bred resentment, resentment bred fear, and fear, when pressed hard enough, bred actions no one ever intended to commit. Miss Marple turned the events of the afternoon over carefully in her mind. Miss Hartnell had knowledge she should not have had, knowledge that made her dangerous to Lavinia Vine. But was knowledge alone enough to explain the blood-stained crochet, the hidden violence? Not yet. There were still missing pieces. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, allowing the pattern to settle into place. In her mind, the coarse thread in the crochet, the trembling hands, the fear, the resentment, and somewhere, hidden among these threads, the final knot that would undo everything. Outside, the church bells chimed 6 o'clock, their melancholy notes rolling over the village roofs, and Miss Marple, wise and watchful, smiled faintly to herself. The time for gentle observation was nearly over. Soon she would need to tug the right thread, and watch the whole tangle come undone. Chapter 7. A second shock 2 days after the disastrous guild meeting. The village awoke to another grim disturbance, one that sent a fresh jolt through the already frayed nerves of St. Mildred's-on-the-Green. It was the vicar's wife, Mrs. Forsyth, who first raised the alarm. In the early morning, walking her little terrier past Fernwood House, she noticed the side gate ajar, swinging gently on its hinges in the breeze. Curious and concerned, she ventured inside the grounds, calling out timidly. No answer came. The sun had only just risen, the dew still glistening on the lawns, when she found Miss Hartnell lying crumpled at the foot of the old summer-house steps. Scream she gave rang out across the village green, setting curtains twitching and drawing sleepy faces to windows. Within the hour, Inspector Craddock and 2 constables had arrived. An ambulance from Lower Milbury was summoned. The doctor confirmed what Miss Marple had already suspected the moment she arrived. Miss Hartnell was alive, but only barely. A nasty blow to the head, perhaps from a fall or something worse. No witnesses, no clear explanation. The village buzzed with dreadful energy. 2 tragedies now centred around Fernwood House, and 2 victims connected to Lavinia Vine. Miss Marple moved quietly among the knot of concerned villagers gathered outside the gate, observing, listening, thinking. She watched Lavinia's face, tight, pale, composed with great effort, as she spoke to Inspector Craddock. She was unstable, Lavinia said with a hard edge to her voice. She had been distressed of late. Perhaps she fell. She often grew dizzy when agitated. Craddock said nothing, merely noting her words with his usual steady pen. Miss Marple thought otherwise. Miss Hartnell's injuries were not consistent with a simple fall. There was bruising on the wrists, a telltale graze on the knuckles, signs of a struggle. Someone had tried to silence her. Someone had panicked, and acted with haste. The question now was whether it was an act of guilt or an act of fear. Later, that day, while the village swirled with fresh speculation, Miss Marple made a discreet visit to the hospital. Miss Hartnell, pale and frail as a snowdrop, lay in a small bed near the window, breathing in shallow, painful gasps. She was conscious, but weak, too weak to say much. Nevertheless, her eyes flickered wide with recognition and fear when Miss Marple entered. Sitting beside her, Miss Marple took her hand gently. "My dear," she said in her softest voice, "you mustn't tire yourself. But if you know who hurt you, if you know anything about the crochet or what happened at Fernwood, you must trust me." Miss Hartnell's lips trembled. For a moment, Miss Marple thought she would speak, but she only squeezed her hand, faintly, a tear slipping from the corner of her eye. It was enough. Miss Marple rose, her mind already racing ahead. The villagers naturally had theories ready before evening fell. "It's that Harold Sims for sure," said Mrs. Sims fiercely, folding her arms behind the bakery counter. "Couldn't stand being looked down on by ladies like Miss Hartnell." "Or Lavinia Vine herself," countered Mrs. Weatherby and the grocers, "protecting her secrets." At the White Hart, the theories grew even wilder. A London blackmailer, an escaped convict, even rumours of a secret love affair gone tragically wrong. Miss Marple knew better. The truth, as always, was closer to home, and far simpler. Human nature rarely required extravagance to explain it. Pride, fear, resentment. These were the ordinary, deadly motives, and Miss Hartnell knew something. Something that had terrified, someone enough to risk attacking her in broad daylight. The threads were pulling tighter now. The pattern, once hidden in knots and tangles, was beginning to reveal itself. It was not about grand conspiracies or dramatic strangers. It was about small betrayals, and the desperate measures taken to keep them hidden. As Miss Marple sat that evening by her tidy fire, the crochet work in her lap now forgotten, she pieced together the fragments. Lavinia's fear, Miss Hartnell's trembling guilt, the coarse thread, the sudden violence. There was only one conclusion to be drawn. Someone very close to Fernwood, was guilty of more than old secrets. Someone had already tried once to hide their guilt with a symbolic gesture, the blood-stained crochet. And now they had tried again, with something far more brutal. Miss Marple, setting down her knitting at last, smiled grimly to herself. It was time to move carefully, very carefully. The final threads were about to unravel, and the pattern would soon be plain for all to see. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The events surrounding Miss Hartnell's attack unsettled St. Mildred's on the Green in a way that even the blood-stained crochet had not. Where once there had been gossip, now there was true fear. Fear that darkened windows earlier at night, that kept children closer to home, that filled every passing greeting with nervous half-glances. Yet fear, Miss Marple knew, could be a tool as much as it was a danger. Fear revealed things. Under its weight, masks cracked and real faces showed through. It was time, she decided, to test the pattern she had pieced together, to pull just the right thread and watch what unravelled. The opportunity came sooner than she might have hoped. Inspector Craddock, at Miss Marple's gentle suggestion, organised a quiet tea-gathering at the vicarage. It was framed as an innocent parish planning meeting, a way to soothe the village's frayed nerves. But the guest list was deliberate. Lavinia Vine, Harold Sims, Mrs. Sims, Reverend Forsyth, and, crucially, a now somewhat recovered Miss Hartnell, who insisted upon attending despite the doctor's warnings. Miss Marple was there too, naturally, knitting in the corner, the very picture of innocent domesticity. The air inside the vicarage drawing-room was thick with unsaid things. Cups rattled faintly in saucers. Polite conversation wobbled, strained, and collapsed into awkward silences. Miss Marple waited. She knew better than to force such a moment. One had to create the right environment, the right pressure, and then simply observe. She chose her moment carefully. Setting down her knitting with a small, purposeful sigh, she said lightly, "I do hope the person responsible for all this unpleasantness is caught soon. It would be dreadful to think we are sitting here, drinking tea with someone capable of such things." The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. Mrs. Sims gave a nervous laugh. Harold glowered into his cup. Reverend Forsyth cleared his throat loudly. But it was Lavinia Vine's reaction that Miss Marple noted most carefully. Lavinia stiffened. Her hand, halfway to a slice of lemon cake, trembled just slightly before setting the plate down. Her smile, when it came, was brittle as thin ice. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, "surely you don't imagine anything so melodramatic." Miss Marple smiled benignly. "Oh, not melodrama, dear Lavinia. Merely observation. After all, whoever it was must have known the grounds of Fernwood well, must have had access, must have understood the layout. The back gate, the summer house." She let her voice trail off delicately, sipping her tea as if she had merely commented on the weather. Across the room, Miss Hartnell sat very still, her face pale but composed. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, the bandage on her head stark against her hair. And then Miss Marple set the final bait. "Of course," she said in a tone of idle reminiscence, "it does remind me of a case many years ago. A young woman attacked under remarkably similar circumstances. Blood-stained lace left behind, as it happens. A tragic business. The culprit was caught because of the most curious thing." She paused. The room leaned in without realizing it. "It was the crochet, you see. Crochet leaves traces, little things. A wrong tension, a missed loop, a coarser thread where a finer one should be. In that case, the culprit was a woman so desperate to hide her secrets that she betrayed herself with her own handiwork." Miss Marple glanced up just in time to catch it, the flash of panic in Lavinia Vine's eyes, the tiny gasp she smothered, the sudden rigid way her fingers dug into the arms of her chair. Harold Sims looked baffled, Mrs. Sims looked scandalized, and the Reverend appeared merely bewildered. But Lavinia looked trapped. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. Fear had done its work. Before anyone could recover, Miss Hartnell spoke, her voice thin but steady. "It wasn't me," she said. "I never made that crochet piece. I never touched it. The room froze. Inspector Craddock, to his credit, recovered first. Miss Hartnell, are you saying you know who did?" She nodded slowly, wincing at the movement. Her eyes, fragile but determined, turned to Lavinia Vine. "I saw you," she whispered. "That afternoon. I went to the summer house for fresh air. You were there. You had something red, in your hands. I didn't know what it was then." Lavinia's face drained of colour. "You little fool," she said, her voice low and shaking. "You don't know what you're saying." But Miss Hartnell pressed on. The words tumbled out now, as though a dam had burst. I thought perhaps it was a charity piece you had spoiled. I didn't question it. I didn't want trouble. But after the maid found the crochet, and the rumours started, I remembered." Inspector Craddock stood slowly. "Mrs. Vine, I think you had better come with me." Lavinia laughed then, a sharp, brittle sound that made even the vicar flinch. "For what?" she snapped. "For trying to preserve what little reputation I had left. for trying to keep my house, my life, from falling apart. She rose, trembling but proud. Fernwood was all I had left, she said bitterly. After my husband's disgrace, after the debts, after the shame, I built everything back, stone by stone. And then she pointed a trembling finger at Miss Hartnell, threatened to destroy it all. Miss Hartnell shook her head. I never meant to. You knew too much, Lavinia spat, about the missing trust money, about the false investments. If it came out, I would lose everything. Miss Marple's voice, when she spoke, was as soft as falling snow. So you tried to frighten her, she said. Not to kill, not at first, just a warning, a crude symbol, blood and lace, to hint at worse things. Lavinia closed her eyes. But it wasn't enough, was it? Miss Marple continued gently. Because fear has a way of slipping from one hand to another. And when Miss Hartnell didn't take the hint, you panicked. The silence in the room was unbearable. At last, Lavinia straightened her shoulders. Her voice was calm now, almost detached. I had no choice, she said simply. Inspector Craddock gestured to the constable by the door. As Lavinia Vine was quietly led away, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her knitting resting quietly in her lap. The pattern was complete now. Every stitch, every tangle, every frayed edge, all woven into a tapestry of pride, fear, and ruin. Another small tragedy, hidden beneath the neat hedges and tidy lanes of St. Mildred's on the Green, and Miss Marple, watching the last threads fall into place, knew again, as she always did, that evil rarely wore monstrous faces. Most often it wore respectable shoes, polite smiles, and hands once capable of beautiful, delicate crochet. Chapter 9. The Full Reveal. The next morning, with the rain tapping softly against the windows of the vicarage, Inspector Craddock convened a small private gathering. It was not a formal event, but a necessity. A moment to sort through the tangled web left in the wake of Lavinia Vine's arrest. In attendance were those most deeply entangled in the affair. Miss Marple, Reverend Forsyth and his wife, Miss Hartnell, still pale but determined, and of course the inspector himself, notebook in hand. Outside, St. Mildred's on the Green continued its life as though nothing had changed, though Miss Marple suspected that gossip already rustled through the hedgerows faster than the wind itself. Inspector Craddock, clearing his throat, looked toward Miss Marple with the unspoken invitation she recognized so well. It was time to lay out the truth, carefully, plainly, gently. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, folded her hands, and began. To understand how we came to this point, she said softly, we must start not with the blood-stained crochet, nor even with the events of the tea party, but with something much older, the hidden history of Fernwood House. The others leaned in, unconsciously drawn by the calm authority in her voice. Lavinia Vine, Miss Marple continued, lived under the shadow of scandal for many years. Her husband's disgrace, the lost investments, the embezzlement, was never entirely forgotten, however much society preferred not to mention it openly. When she returned to Fernwood, it was not as the triumphant heiress of old, but as a woman fighting desperately to reclaim a shred of respectability. Miss Hartnell lowered her eyes, a faint tremor passing through her frame. In such a situation, Miss Marple said gently. Appearances become everything, and secrets, particularly financial secrets, become deadly burdens. Inspector Craddock nodded slowly. The missing trust money. Yes, Miss Marple said. Lavinia was not merely trying to maintain her lifestyle. She was hiding the fact that much of the remaining family fortune was, in truth, built on precarious foundations. Fraud, concealed investments, misappropriated funds, all hidden neatly away beneath the genteel veneer of village life. She turned her gaze kindly toward Miss Hartnell. And you, dear Miss Hartnell, stumbled too close to the truth. The poor woman gave a shaky nod. I didn't mean to, she whispered. It was all in the papers I helped organize, the hospital donations, the estate paperwork. I saw inconsistencies. I didn't understand them at first. I didn't want to believe. But you did, Miss Marple said gently, and Lavinia realized it. The room was silent except for the soft ticking of the vicar's clock. She could not risk exposure, Miss Marple continued, so she devised a plan, a crude, desperate plan. She staged a discovery, the blood-stained crochet, intending to create a distraction, a dramatic event that would stir the village, shift attention, and perhaps even drive you away in fear, Miss Hartnell. Inspector Craddock frowned. But why the crochet? Miss Marple's smile was almost sad, because crochet is a symbol of patience, of delicacy, of control. It was Lavinia's way of asserting dominance over a situation she felt slipping away. And in her haste, she used the wrong materials. Coarse thread from old household supplies mixed with her finer work, a detail she never imagined would betray her. Miss Marple paused to let the weight of that settle. And when fear alone failed to silence Miss Hartnell, she said more quietly, Lavinia resorted to violence. Miss Hartnell's hands twisted in her lap. She confronted me, she said in a small voice. Near the summer house, she said I was making trouble, that if I loved Fernwood, if I respected the family, I would keep silent. I tried to leave. She grabbed me. Tears glistened briefly in her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. I fell. I don't remember anything after that. Miss Marple nodded. It was not premeditated murder, she said gently. It was panic, desperation, but the result was the same. Inspector Craddock leaned back heavily in his chair. And Harold Sims? Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. Poor Harold Sims. His only crime was a surly manner and an unfortunate reputation. Convenient scapegoats are easy to find, Inspector. But the real guilt often lies closer to the heart. Craddock closed his notebook with a soft thud. Remarkable, he muttered. And you saw all this from a piece of crochet. Miss Marple's smile widened slightly. One sees a great deal if one knows where to look, Inspector. Crochet, like human nature, reveals its pattern stitch by stitch. There was a long, thoughtful silence. Then Mrs. Forsyth, dabbing her eyes delicately with a lace-edged handkerchief, said, It's so terribly sad. I always thought Mrs. Vine was such a fine figure of a woman. Miss Marple's voice, when she answered, was very soft. She was a fine figure, she said, and a proud one. But pride, when wounded, can be far more dangerous than hatred. Lavinia, Vine believed she was fighting for survival, and in doing so, she destroyed the very thing she had tried so hard to protect. The vicar sighed deeply. "And so it ends," he said. "Another tragedy hidden behind respectable walls." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt with neat hands. "No, Reverend," she said gently. "It does not end. It simply continues. In whispers, in memories, in the small, persistent tragedies that weave themselves into the fabric of village life." She picked up her knitting bag, her needles clicking softly as she tucked them away. "Life," she said, "is much like crochet. A single missed stitch can distort the entire pattern, and no matter how carefully one tries to hide it, the flaw is always there, waiting to be found." With that, Miss Marple stepped out into the rain-washed morning, leaving behind the comfort of the vicarage hearth and the lingering shadows of Fernwood House. Outside, St. Mildred's on the Green lay quiet and glistening, its hedgerows heavy with silvered drops, its chimneys sending lazy curls of smoke into the damp air. And somewhere beyond the neat gardens and polished windows, life, fragile, messy, beautiful life, went steadily on. Chapter 10. Aftermath and Reflection. The weeks following Lavinia Vine's arrest passed slowly, like a river thawing after a long, bitter winter. At first, St. Mildred's on the Green buzzed with restless energy, every corner of the village alive with gossip, theories, and half-remembered slights. It seemed for a time that no conversation could begin without a furtive glance toward Fernwood House, or a whispered lament for how things like this could happen in such a peaceful place. But human nature, as Miss Marple knew so well, had a stubborn instinct for survival. It was not long before the rhythms of village life began to reassert themselves. The Fernwood garden, once so carefully tended by Lavinia's gardener, grew wild, roses sprawling untamed across the hedgerows, curtains remained drawn in the upper windows. Rumours abounded that the house would be sold. To outsiders perhaps, or worse, to weekend visitors from London who would never understand the soil under their feet. Miss Hartnell, recovering slowly from her injuries, had moved into a modest cottage near the churchyard, a quiet place with neat borders and a view of the hills. The villagers treated her kindly, though their kindness was edged with the faint reserve that always greeted those who had been too close to tragedy. Miss Marple paid her regular visits, bringing little comforts, a jar of preserves, a tray of fresh scones, a new packet of crochet thread, and never once pressed her for talk of the past. Such wounds, she knew, closed best when left to heal in silence. At the White Hart, conversation had shifted back to safer ground. Mr. Greaves, the grocer, discussed the price of eggs with passionate indignation. Mrs. Sims resumed her eternal feud with the postmaster over the placement of the village notice board. And though the name Lavinia Vine still surfaced now and again, mostly in lowered voices over cups of milky tea, the villagers of St. Mildred's on the Green did what villagers had always done. They moved forward, one cautious step at a time. It was bright afternoon in early spring when Miss Marple found herself once again walking past Fernwood House. The garden gate sagged slightly on its hinges, the gravel path overgrown with moss. She paused, resting lightly on her walking stick, and regarded the house with a thoughtful expression. It was strange, she reflected, how quickly nature reclaimed abandoned spaces. Already the garden had begun to soften, wild grasses creeping over the neat beds, ivy threading its way up the stone walls. Soon enough, Fernwood would be just another old house, its proud history faded into local legend, its scandals reduced to whispered warnings for curious children. A small sound made her turn. It was young Peter Woodham, kicking a battered ball along the lane. He stopped shyly when he saw her and gave a polite tug of his cap. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said. "Good afternoon, Peter," she replied with a smile. "And how is school?" Peter grimaced. "Arithmetic's a beast, miss, but Mum says I must stick to it." "Quite right," said Miss Marple firmly. "Patience and perseverance, Peter. They are the keys to all worthwhile things." He nodded solemnly and scampered off, his ball bouncing ahead of him. Miss Marple continued on her way, her mind wandering not to arithmetic, but to the quiet lessons stitched into the recent tragedy. There were those, she thought, who imagined evil as a grand theatrical thing, villains in dark cloaks plotting in smoky rooms. But she knew better. Evil, more often than not, wore the face of pride, of desperation, of wounded vanity clinging to respectability with blooded fingers. Lavinia Vine had not been a monster. She had been a woman afraid of disgrace, of losing everything she had clawed back from ruin, and in her fear she had done monstrous things. Miss Marple paused at the churchyard gate, leaning lightly on the iron rail. Beyond the low stone wall, the graves of generations lay under the soft spring sky. Simple stones, crooked and worn, bearing names now forgotten, except by a few aging villagers. Life, death, scandal, sorrow, all bound together like stitches in a vast, endless tapestry. Miss Marple found comfort in the thought, comfort and a deep, abiding understanding that the world, for all its flaws, carried on. At the church door, she encountered Reverend Forsyth, emerging with a basket of parish records under his arm. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, adjusting his spectacles. "A most blessed afternoon, isn't it?" "Indeed, Reverend," she agreed warmly. He hesitated, then said in a lower voice, "I sometimes wonder if we failed Mrs. Vine, if we might have seen more, helped more." Miss Marple touched his arm gently. "My dear Reverend," she said, "people do not wear their burdens openly. We cannot always prevent tragedy. We can only offer kindness, and hope it is enough." The vicar sighed. "Wise as ever, Miss Marple." She smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Not wisdom, Reverend, merely experience." With that, she left him, her steps steady as she made her way back along the lane. The village square bustled faintly in the distance. The clink of milk churns, the cry of children at play, the steady tap of Mrs. Sims adjusting her bakery. Signs, innocent Mildred's on the green lived on, weaving its quiet patterns over the scars of its darker moments. And Miss Marple, as she reached her own neat garden gate, paused to admire the first brave crocuses poking through the thawing earth. There was always new life, always another beginning, hidden among the endings. Inside, she set her basket down, placed her knitting neatly by her chair, and lit the fire. She had a new crochet pattern to begin, a complex one, full of delicate loops and subtle turns. Outside, the village clock struck 4, its notes clear and unwavering against the soft hum of life returning. And Miss Marple, wise and patient, bent to her work once more, weaving her quiet, steadfast wisdom into every stitch, every pattern, every fragile, enduring thread of human life. A tapestry never truly finished. The seasons turned as they always did, softening the hard lines winter had left upon St. Mildred's on the Green. By April, the hedgerows were a riot of green shoots and white blossom. The lanes, once cloaked in fog and fear, warmed under soft sun. Children raced again across the green. The old men of the White Hart resumed their slow, eternal games of dominoes under the chestnut trees. To the casual visitor, it might have seemed that nothing had ever disturbed the peace of the village. But Miss Marple, who knew every crack in the church walls, every crooked paving stone, every habitual gesture of her neighbours, understood better. Scars remained, even when they were invisible. The Fernwood House scandal had left its mark, stitched invisibly into the fabric of village life, a change not spoken aloud, but present all the same. There were small signs, if one knew where to look. The way Mrs. Sims now hesitated before speaking ill of anyone, the way the Reverend lingered longer at the door of lonely parishioners, the way laughter, once easy, now carried a faint edge of wariness. Miss Marple moved gently through these changed streets, her presence a comfort to those who still struggled to forget. She never spoke of Lavinia Vine unless asked. And even then her answers were brief, kind, and measured. Some wounds, she knew, should not be prodded, but time, careful, relentless time, worked its quiet magic. By early May, new life had begun to claim even Fernwood House. A young couple from London, the Carringtons, had purchased the property, modern, cheerful, and possessed of that easy optimism found only in those who had never yet learned fear. They set about restoring Fernwood's faded grandeur with brisk energy. The tangled gardens were pruned, the gravel paths raked and swept, curtains billowed once again from the upstairs windows, and in the evenings warm light spilled from the newly polished glass. Miss Marple, from her seat in the churchyard, often watched the Carringtons at their work. She liked them. They reminded her, in some ways, of seedlings pushing up through the cracked soil of an old garden, life asserting itself, hope, stubborn and fragile, refusing to be extinguished. And yet, sometimes she caught herself wondering, when the new Mrs. Carrington arranged her wildflowers in the old blue vase Lavinia had once favoured, or when Mr. Carrington trimmed the very wisteria that had shaded darker deeds, whether the house itself remembered. Miss Marple did not believe in hauntings, not in the rattling chains and moaning corridors of sensation novels, but she believed in memory. Places, like people, could hold on to what they had seen. One afternoon in late spring, Miss Marple received a letter from Miss Hartnell. It was a modest note written in the neat, careful hand of someone determined not to waste a single word. Dear Miss Marple, I hope this letter finds you well. I wished to thank you, not merely for your kindness after my injury, but for your wisdom, your patience, and your unflagging belief that truth, even painful truth, matters. I have decided to leave St. Mildred's for a time. An old friend has offered me a position in Bath, where I shall assist with parish work and perhaps teach needlework classes at the Women's Institute. It is a fresh start I scarcely dared hope for. Please believe me when I say that I hold no bitterness in my heart toward Mrs. Vine. Only sorrow and gratitude, dear Miss Marple, that you were there to see what I could not. Yours very sincerely, Margaret Hartnell. Miss Marple smiled as she folded the letter carefully and placed it with others in her writing desk. A fresh start. How rare, how precious a thing that was. She was pleased for Miss Hartnell, pleased that she had found a path out of the long shadows of Fernwood's decline. And yet, as she sat by her window, the village stretched out before her in gentle, sunlit waves. Miss Marple felt a familiar weight settle over her heart. There was no such thing as a true ending, only a folding over of one layer upon another, a weaving of old sorrows into new beginnings. She took up her crochet, the same delicate runner she had begun months before, in the days when Harriet's disappearance had first unsettled the piece, and threaded her needle through the loops with steady hands. Each stitch was deliberate, each pattern recalled. Some were crooked, mistakes she left uncorrected, reminders that perfection was neither possible nor perhaps desirable. Mistakes were part of the whole. Without them, the fabric would have no life. There was a knock at the door, brisk, friendly. It was Peter Woodham, holding a battered basket full of primroses. "Mum says these are for you, miss," he said, cheeks pink with pride. "For the hospital fundraiser." Miss Marple accepted the flowers with a warm smile. "Tell your mother I am most grateful," she said, "and remind her that kindness like primroses thrives best when given freely." Peter beamed and scampered away, his small boots leaving muddy prints on the step. Miss Marple set the basket carefully by the window and returned to her chair. Outside, the village stirred with quiet life, the blacksmith's hammer ringing faintly, the scent of new-mown grass on the air, the soft bleating of lambs from the far meadow. It would be easy to believe, looking at it, that nothing had changed, but Miss Marple knew better. Change came not in grand parades or blaring headlines, but in the smallest shifts, the deeper lines around a neighbour's eyes, the slight pause before an old joke, the new caution in a once carefree greeting. And yet life endured. It was a lesson she had learned again and again, that human hearts, for all their frailty, were stubborn things, capable of healing, of mending, of weaving new patterns over old wounds. She finished the last row of her crochet and sat back, examining it with a critical eye. Not perfect, never perfect, but intricate, beautiful in its own flawed way. A tapestry of patience, of mistakes, of perseverance, just like the village itself, just like life. Miss Marple placed the finished runner carefully in her work-basket, tying the ends neatly. Tomorrow she would take it to the church bazaar. A small offering, a small continuation of the quiet, enduring work that stitched the village together, an act of kindness, one gentle gesture at a time. She rose, her joints stiff but her spirit light, and opened the window to let in the sweet breath of spring. The breeze stirred the lace curtains, carrying with it the scent of earth and blossom, and the soft, distant peal of the church bells, calling the village once more to ordinary, blessed life. And as Miss Marple stood there, framed in the gentle afternoon light, she smiled. A smile filled with all the sorrow and all the stubborn, enduring hope of a woman who had seen the worst of human nature and still believed in its quiet capacity for goodness.